Can you hear in the back? All right, good. So welcome, and I think tonight we have a really exciting event, and I'm happy to be here. I'm Hertha Sweet Wong, professor in the Department of English and chair of the Department of Art Practice at UC Berkeley, and I'm really pleased to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Rirkirit. First, of course, I want to thank everyone who has helped co-sponsor this talk. So thank you to the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts and the David Brower Center, and on the UC Berkeley campus, the Arts Research Center, the Department of Art Practice, and Berkeley Center for New Media. Thank you for working together to make this happen. So I'll say just a few words. Some of you, this is old news. Some of you, it may be new news, but by way of introduction to tonight's talk. A conceptual artist of Thai descent, born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and raised in Thailand, Ethiopia, and Canada, Tiravanija, the epitome of a global citizen, or perhaps a member of the increasingly crowded diaspora, lives in New York, Berlin, and Chiang Mai, Thailand. Tiravanija studied at the Ontario College of Art in Toronto and the Banff Center School of Fine Arts, and then attended the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Independent Study Program at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. Tiravanija is in the Bay Area as a 2015 artist in residence at the Headlands Center for the Arts, working closely with the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. Tiravanija is categorized by some art scholars as practicing relational aesthetics, a movement in art in which the artist initiates social exchanges and interactions as key components of an art practice, bringing the art and the viewer into intimate relation. It is this very socially engaged aesthetic alchemy that transforms viewers into participants, individuals into communities. Tiravanija's artwork explores all kinds of social roles, and rather than, or perhaps it's better to say as well as objects, art objects, he often creates, more importantly, experiences, opportunities for collaborative working, making, doing, and in the process generates a sense of community, even intimacy, in this materially obsessed global world. Betty Sue Hertz, Director of Visual Studies at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, concludes that, quote, "It may be productive to understand his work as a set of proposals that cross into environmentalism, biography, and politics, as well as food, menus, and kitchens." And also to understand his work as personal, local, though in a variety of specific localities, and political. Tiravanija's art practice is eclectically expansive. Let me know just a few highlights. In his 1990 series, Pad Thai, he made homemade Thai curry for exhibit visitors at the Paula Allen Gallery in New York. A couple of years later, at 303 Gallery in New York, he transformed the white rooms of the gallery by filling them with what Hertz calls stacks of cultural cast-offs, unquote, thus challenging the notion of a sanctified gallery space reserved for high art objects. In addition to his various installations and performances, Tiravanija has created sculptures, text-based work, wall drawings, and installations in many diverse forms. Stages or rooms or architectural spaces become sites for sharing food, reading together, making music, or simply engaging in one way or another. He has also co-curated several projects, among them Utopia Station at the 2003 Venice Biennale with Molly Nesbitt and Hans Ulrich Obrist. And this brought together books, performances, poster designs, and seminars. Saigon Open City in 2006 and 2007 with Prithia Gawawang that engages with processes of reconstruction, and a long-term project dealing with rice farmers in a village near Chiang Mai, Thailand, entitled The Land, with Cayman with Tshirt. His work may be found in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, Oslo, Norway, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Bangkok, Thailand, the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, New York, Migros Museum for Gegenwartskunst in Zurich, Switzerland, Museo de Arte Contemporáneo de Castilla y León in León, Spain, Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, Modern Art, New York, St. Louis Museum, Art Museum, obviously in St. Louis, and the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and so on. Okay. Not surprisingly, Tiravanija has won several prestigious awards, including the Hugo Boss Prize in 2005, the Absolute Art Award in 2010, the Vanessa Prize by the Naoshima Contemporary Art Museum in Japan, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Lucilia Artist Award. In tonight's lecture, entitled The Way Things Go, Tiravanija will talk about the principles and ideas that are the foundation of his curated exhibition at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. The YBCA website describes the project like this: a special curatorial project with Rirkirit Tiravanija, The Way Things Go, uncovers narratives, reveals personal stories, and shares vignettes that lead to a larger understanding of migration in the production of material culture. For this exhibition, contemporary artist Tiravanija invited artists from Asia and Europe, as well as from the San Francisco Bay Area, to contribute works related to the circulation and anthropology of seeds, plants, food, recipes, and related materials of kitchen culture that have migrated across regions and time. The group exhibition features an expansive range of work: film, mixed media installations, video, and performance. The exhibition then focuses on the origins and global circulation of people and things, of objects, raising awareness about issues of labor, who makes these things, trade, who transports them, colonization, who controls these global circuits of objects, politics, who decides on trade policies, and war, who has the power to impose their will. Raises a lot of questions that affect every one of us, and the exhibit is showing through Sunday, May 24th. So I'd like to have you join me in welcoming Rirkirit Tiravanija.
I thought I was in heaven listening to my life go by. That was very thorough. I don't know if I could continue to lecture now. Well, thanks for coming. Such a big crowd. I was not expecting that. I'm going to talk about the exhibition and the artists in the exhibition. So. It's not something I usually do because I've curated exhibitions, but I never really have to explain why I did it. And I guess I was still trying to figure out why I did it, and how, and the reasons for how, the shape and the idea of the exhibition came together. I first had a completely different idea of an exhibition when I came to Yerba Buena, and then I realized that idea wasn't going to work, so I had to reshape it. But one of the works in the exhibition was pretty much kind of prominently in the back of my head, and that was a work of a young Thai artist that I'll talk about a little bit once we go on. I guess in the process of making my own work, I often try to figure out where things come from or where things start, and often it's more like a lot of thinking behind in terms of the process of it. So I cultivate it in my head. I keep it cooking for a while before something actually happens, and partly it's because of the way, I've been living and working in this nomadic condition. And I was saying to some of the students that I visited this past couple of days that I basically don't have a studio practice because I didn't want to have a lot of things. And not to have a lot of things mean that I could, move easily, fluidly, and not have to be burdened by objects in a way. So I would travel and I would go to a place and I would often try to speak to a lot of people and try to sense, you know, how or what they're thinking about or the situation that they're in before I start to think about the work itself or before I really think about what to do. And then often in that kind of process of maybe a kind of relational process where, you know, through the person who I'm involved with or a lot of people I'm involved with, I get a kind of sense of like what should be done, and then I would, you know, go about trying to do it. This is an image from one of the Situationist maps, and I guess for me, the idea of kind of, you know, wandering and bumping into things was quite important in terms of how I've kind of conducted myself and worked with the situations that I'm in. So I just wanted to have this, and in a way, I think if you've seen the poster of the exhibition, it has a kind of relationship to this kind of mapping of how things kind of, you know, flow through space and time and landscape. If there are any questions, please just ask. A friend of mine, the artist Pierre Huyghe, talked to me about a film like about 10 years ago, and he kept saying to me that I needed to see this film because somehow he saw a relationship in that film to my work. The film is called The Genesis of a Meal by French filmmaker Luc Moulet. And I'm not sure how many people have been to the exhibition, but if you get to the exhibition, there is a corner and where you can sit and watch this film, which, you know, runs for like an hour and a half. And in the film, the filmmaker was basically started with the idea of his breakfast. And I mean, his breakfast was a banana and I think banana, egg, and tuna, can of tuna. And which doesn't make any sense, but anyway, through those three things, you know, he kind of traces back the origin, or at least the path by which where these three different elements of his breakfast came from. And in tracing back to that, you know, find a lot of relationship to how, you know, how society and how politics become involved with how things get made or how things get sent around or how things get produced. So this is an image of a factory in China where they're making the computer that I'm using to show this slide projection. And of course, we all know that, you know, there are concerns about how the workers and all the people working in the factory are treated. There's a story about T-shirt that has been worn by politicians in England, which is a T-shirt that supports basically women labor in the third world. And then the daily newspaper in London went and found out that the T-shirt was being made by a factory in Africa, and the ladies who were making the T-shirts were not very well treated. You know, so this kind of all continues to roll. There's the breakfast. So if you went through everything you had on yourself right now, you know, and started to trace back as to where it came from, you will find a great deal of story behind it. And you'll, you know, from basically from, you know, your underpants to your eyeglasses, whatever. And I think the film of Luc Moulet kind of takes you through all those motions and traces, which I think for me is part of the kind of genesis of this kind of exhibition, where, you know, I want to find and see how, in a way, the artist goes back and finds his source, and through that source, how the narrative of the work comes out. This is some still images of a video by Fischli and Weiss. It's called The Way Things Go, which is of course the title of the exhibition. And I've been looking at this video for, like, you know, since I've known Fischli and Weiss. And I think it's probably one of their most famous, you know, work, because it's readily available on YouTube. And even Honda, or one of those car companies, even ripped off their idea and remade it into an ad. So, you know, the artworks then return into, like, the real world. But again, like, from this video itself, which actually for me is more like playing as a metaphor for, like, how I see the things working within the exhibition itself, right? Actually, I would like to play the video, but I'm very bad at making these slide presentations, so I might try to pick it up and play it later as we end the thing. This is a little pile of earth that in the museum in Gwangju, and you can see that there are little kind of you know, weeds growing, and the artist Marie-Thérèse Alves, who made this work or series of kind of a presentation, was in Gwangju and traced the kind of, in a way, like how the plants in perhaps this rubble would travel around the world and return again. And in her work, she starts off with very prehistoric ideas and places, and then maps out how the possibility of, like, human interaction and relationship and coincidences carries through history this idea that would take the seed around the world and then become spreaded out as you travel through the globe. Of course, as you start to read this map, or a kind of roots of, like, where things traveled and who had been part of this history, and from basically Central Asia through China, and then back again to Europe, and also through the histories of politics and trade through the East India Company. I also have to look at some notes because these artists' names are very difficult. The artists Van Brummelen and De Haan from Rotterdam, from Amsterdam, actually also work very similarly. And their work is called the Monument to the Sugar. Yeah. And what had happened, sorry? What had happened was that they were working on a project and they were on the research, and they went to Poland when Poland was entering in to become a part of the EU. And they were at the border between Poland and Ukraine, and they were looking at the traffic lines of cars, I guess from Poland going to the Ukraine and vice versa. And they were talking to a farmer on the side of the road, and the farmer gave them some coffee and some homemade sausage. And through the conversation, the farmer mentioned to them that you know, the sugar, now that Poland has become the EU, the sugar in Poland has become much sweeter. And the reason for that is because the price of sugar in Poland has gone up. And the same sugar which is in Ukraine is a lot cheaper. So people would have to drive to the Ukraine to buy sugar and return back to Poland with their Polish sugar. So this prompted them to then make a research into the kind of trade which went on in terms with sugar from the EU, and they found out that through subsidies, the sugar from the European Union was shipped off to Nigeria at a subsidized price. So it was cheaper to buy sugar in Nigeria than in Europe. So what they did was they decided to go down to Lagos, to Nigeria, and to buy sugar down there and to ship it back to Europe. But at the same time, there was a kind of clause or a kind of law which they used in order to ship the sugar back. And this law was, it's a technical term. It's called the Harmonization Code 9703. And what that means is that that this allows for free passage of all monuments and artworks to travel back to Europe without any taxation. So that's why. So they decide to make the sugars into cubes, into blocks, and then, as you can see in the photo, and then ship them back as a monument for the exhibition. If you come to see the show here at the center, you realize that there's only, at this moment, only 2 blocks of sugar sitting in the space. And the reason for that is because the sugar that they have been shipped over for the exhibition is stuck at the port in LA. And we don't really know when it's going to actually be released. And it could, of course, you know, might not be released at all. So again, like the idea that, you know, this kind of movement of goods and things and are always kind of being, you know, controlled and being affected by different regulations and different construction. Along with the cubes, they have a film that they made. It's a 60mm film which plays alongside, which has, of course, like landscapes and images from Africa to give you a sense of like the landscape and all the conditions that the sugar went and came through. This is work by the artist Camille Henry, and she's a French artist who works and lives now in New York. she was actually given a grant from the French government to come and work on a project. And she herself worked in a way, though, as an artist, very much her practice is as if she's like a kind of a cultural anthropologist. So she goes to places and study different conditions, of course, like relating to her ideas and very much to herself. She was asked to go to New Orleans and to work on an exhibition there at the museum. And she went there and found out that there was a tribe of Native Americans that was, I would say, in a kind of limbo, in a status of limbo, because they were not acknowledged as a native tribe. And they had been kind of working towards trying to be recognized as a tribe, because of course with that recognition comes certain kinds of benefits. And so she went down there and lived with the tribe and made videos and films of the people. And of course, because it is in Louisiana, there's a great deal of influence from when the French had been, I guess, you know, in a way like the colonized that part of the world. So through her work, she also kind of picked up this kind of parallel in terms of like how the influence of the French had also made an impression on this native tribe. This is the work of Bay Area artist Michael Arcega, and of course Michael is his background is as a Filipino, and he had been working on this idea of Nasarema, which is basically the word America spelled backward. And there had been a paper written by a I guess an anthropologist, and it was a kind of a paper about the idea of Nasarema, which is like a study on this group of people. And clearly the paper, of course, was a kind of, in a way, a parody of the idea of...
It's 8 o'clock.
Oh, sorry. Time to go home. So the paper was a kind of, would be a kind of, I would say, a kind of anthropological study, based on the idea of reflecting on the ironies of America. And Michael has been working with through reading those papers, and have been making sculptures based on those ideas. This work is called The New Colossus. And it's based on the poem by Emma Lazarus. So each of the objects that you see on the shelf basically is a kind of his kind of indexing of the poem through the object. Another work by Michael called Lexical Borrowing, Sawhorse by the Seashore, Understanding Manifest Destiny. And lexical borrowing is a kind of linguistic process, I guess, that contributes to the generation and change in language. And in a way, this process, of course, is relevant to the idea of a kind of idea of Creole languages or Pidgin language. So through these objects and through this sculpture, Michael is trying to, of course, play out the different way that a new idea could be formed through. This is a very difficult work to photograph, I think. It's this is the work of a young Thai artist called Irene Jang. And this was one of the works that I was mentioning earlier that was quite central to my idea of curating this exhibition and how it came about. The work was originally done for the Venice Biennial and for the Thai Pavilion. What you see is hanging sculpture which resembles kind of a teardrop. But the teardrop is actually the shape of a Thai dessert called the golden teardrop. In Thai it's called Tong Yot. And this dessert, which we have, we often would have this dessert during special ceremonies. Usually when we have a Buddhistic ceremony with monks, we would serve this to the monks, because of course they were seen as a kind of like a precious kind of dessert. And there was always a kind of story behind the fact that these desserts had been originated by the Portuguese. And like many things, we know that it's mythically come from Portugal. We don't really know why. And in the work itself, Irene has the sculpture, and then he also has a video that accompanies the sculpture. And in the video, you would see a Japanese lady who is slowly in the kitchen, slowly preparing basically the dessert. And she narrates the story about how she met her husband, who was Thai, and how she came to Thailand and how she started to simulate herself to the culture, and how she also learned the dessert. She also talks about her grandparents or her grandmother. And so there was a kind of personal story about this relationship to Thailand and the food. And parallel to that, you see workers working in a factory, a small factory, and making basically the casting for these objects. There is a voiceover narrative that tells you the story of how the dessert came from Japan through the nunnery in Japan, where a princess was kind of cascaded to this nunnery, and then she, having lived with the nuns, somehow picked up, the recipe, and that recipe was then slowly somehow filtered down through to Thailand. This is the artist Shimabukuro, Japanese artist, and this is an installation he had done in Marseille, in France. And basically that's him sleeping inside a hammock that is suspended, I think, like, 15 meters up in the air. And the hammock is suspended on a kind of a rope, which is like 160 something feet long. And the reason for that is because Shimabukuro had been in a temple in the south of Japan, and he had seen a little painting of a mermaid in the temple. So he inquired with the monk in the temple and found out that this was a kind of a representation of a mermaid that had came ashore near this temple, and inside the temple there was a kind of small box with some bones, supposedly from the mermaid. And the mermaid was mythically was told that the mermaid was 168 feet long. And so therefore Shimabukuro decided to take this narrative and story of the mermaid wherever he traveled. And so he went to France when he was in an exhibition, in a group exhibition in France. So he brought the idea of like sleeping with the mermaid by suspending himself in this hammock. And so when he came to San Francisco, of course, again, like working with the place and the context that he's in, he decides to try to make a sourdough bread. And he didn't quite get to make a 163 feet mermaid, but he got a mermaid made out of bread, which he collaborated with the kind of baking institute, which is in the South San Francisco area. And I thought initially that we were all going to eat the mermaid, but we didn't. But we had a lot of bread at the opening. And I think at this point the mermaid has to be changed every couple of weeks. So I think he asked the bakers to next to make a rope that's 168 feet long out of bread, as an idea. This is a vase that was in a museum in Holland. And this is a work, a kind of collaborative work by the Danish artist group called Superflex, and with a group from Vietnam called the Propeller Group. So Superflex was invited to the museum in northern Holland to do an exhibition. And so when they went to Holland, of course, they went to the museum and they started to look around, and they found this vase, which was supposedly coming from Southeast Asia. And then they found out the story that this vase was kind of a pirated object that the Dutch had pirated from the Portuguese in, I think it's 1600. And there's a story that the ship, the Portuguese ship, was in Goa and loaded with all the goods from Southeast Asia. But apparently at that time there was no porcelain in Europe, so this would have been the first shipment of porcelain from Asia to Europe. And the Portuguese ship encountered like 3 Dutch ships, and they had a fight, and the Portuguese gave it up, and the Dutch took all the loot. And when they returned, they had it auctioned off. And because at that time there was no porcelain in Europe, apparently this loot actually funded the Dutch in gaining independence against Spain. And some of the porcelains also went to the Queen of England and King of France. And so when the Superflex found this story, they asked the museum to transport the vase back to Vietnam. And actually, I think then they had it replicated. And then they worked with the Propeller Group to make a soap opera about the vase. And basically, of course, in the installation that you see at the museum, there are three series of soap opera that was made in Vietnam and was also shown on Vietnamese television. And when they made the film, they also made props and costumes for the film. And in return, the museum then collected the props and therefore somehow kind of taken the future back to the past and back again into the future. And this is one of the kind of costume, and they're pirate costumes and things like that that they made for the TV show. This is the Museum of Gourd, and it's a project by a Japanese professor who I think made the gourd as a kind of metaphor through his research. At the time when the Fukushima nuclear power plant had collapsed, and Chihiro Minato, is the name of the professor, made a small installation at the Taiwan Biennale based on the gourd. And he had kind of used the gourd as a kind of metaphor for the idea of fluidity and the idea of liberty. And of course the gourd is a plant or vegetable that has been in the history of man for as long as I think we know. And for him it was like about how the vessel could kind of give us a way to survive these kinds of, what he called it, the high-tech disaster by using low-tech, forms to kind of continue to survive. In his installation, he also invites the participation of other artists and non-artists. So there's a kind of collection whenever the museum is put together of like local objects made from gourd. So from the gourd we go to the bitter melon. So this is the work by a group of people based in the Bay Area and in Japan, and this is called the National Bitter Melon Council. And of course they again use the idea of this plant or this vegetable again as a kind of idea of metaphor for a kind of, I would say, perhaps for both as food and as emotional, metaphor. And the idea that the bitterness of the taste of the melon could be enjoyed enjoyed by certain people and not by everyone, but also by different certain cultures that are used to and consume this particular plant. And they've made a kind of campaign to promote the idea of the bitter melon. Of course, the group of artists themselves used the idea of performance and kind of community activation to bring together, groups of people and stories and narratives based on the idea of this bitter melon. So there are stories and memories of perhaps for a lot of people who are thinking about their roots and their homes, and how they kind of remember the idea of this plant. So there are recipes as well as kind of stories. And again, the idea of living in a foreign place and trying to return to your roots, or to kind of have certain memories of the place where you came from, is in the work of the artist Tassanai Setasiri. And Tassanai is a Thai artist who at one point came to study in Chicago, and he was living in the south side of Chicago. And in that moment he was working closely with some people from the Thai community who was living in Chicago. And he asked a lot of the people in this community to give him different kinds of objects and pictures and representations of, at least from their memory, of what their home or their memory of like what it was like to be back in Thailand. And from these different memorabilias, he then kind of reconstructed it into three different kinds of structure, from drawing to sculpture. So sculpture made from the same drawing. And then another Thai artist, another young Thai artist, who has worked a lot with the idea of kind of labor and the kind of exchange of labor. He had worked with going to Sweden to a berry farm where there were Thai laborers working, picking berries. And so the Thai workers would work and collect money and then send the money back to Thailand. And so he had worked with the laborers and then used the money that he himself had collected from the picking the berry to make a work. In this situation, he went to the south of Thailand and to basically work with some Thai Muslim ladies whose husband had been victims of the violence that has been going on in the south of Thailand. So I guess since 9/11 there has been a lot of kind of intervention into the society down there by the military, and there has been a lot of violence and people caught in the crossfire. And so a group of ladies in that part of Thailand got together to make a kind of condiment to basically, on the one hand, to support themselves, because of course all their husbands were killed and dead. And on the other hand, also to kind of bring attention to the situation that they were living in. So Pratya's work, again here in this situation, was to bring the condiments into the exhibition and then to give them away for everyone to take and to use and to taste. And also he asked in return that everyone would take a photograph of themselves while they're consuming the condiment, and then we'll send it back to Thailand for the kind of, in a way, for the promotion of the cause of these ladies in southern Thailand. So that's kind of like the roster of the artists in the exhibition. And any questions? Well, it's difficult to, in a way, narrate how the exhibition is, because I think it involves a lot of spending time and being with the work, and in terms of like to listen and to hear and to think, and in a way that I hope that people would actually be able to like do that and understand perhaps the process and the thinking behind each work. Okay. Yes.
So, thank you for your presentation, and thanks for continuing to do your work. It's been beautiful to see what you've been up to. Globalization is very, very rapid and very rapacious. Art is very slow. It seems like the artists are trying to feel out what globalization might feel like, the stories, the individuals, and scale it down to a size that we can, as humans, experience again. But what do you do with this discrepancy of art being so slow and feelings being so slow and really globalization being so fast? Will we ever catch up?
Well, I think maybe it is about slowing down, perhaps. So I do feel like it is important to try to make a space for that slowness. And I think it's often, I mean, and I would say, of course, like in the work that I'm interested in, the idea of time is very important. And the time that we spend, of course, I mean, with the work, but also the time we spend together around the work is also very important. So I think it's all right to be slow. But I think it needs to be something that's sustained, you know, so that perhaps people can then have more opportunity to have that experience of that slowness. And I think there are always like very different conditions that one could do that. So maybe it's not always necessarily important to do everything inside. Maybe it's good to do things in different kinds of sites and spaces. So the idea of having a project in Thailand, which has been there now maybe over 10 years, you know, and that place is always there. So it's an open situation, which I think and I hope that anyone who goes by to that part of Thailand could have that experience. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about your curatorial process and how you go about the research for putting a show like this together that is so international in its scope, and if you could maybe speak also to how it is similar or different from whatever research you might do as an artist.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting because it's a lot about it's a lot about peripheral things. I mean, a lot of the works in the exhibition I knew about but I'd never seen, for example, and often there are works of people I know, and so we've had discussions about it, and it was kind of, again, it's like a floating system that's in the back of my head, and somehow at some point they all kind of collapse together, and hopefully it works. Yeah, so a lot of the work itself is something that has been there in my interest, and a lot of the work is also was introduced to me by Betty Sue. So, and I think like when we worked, I think also Betty Sue's interest was, quite close to the idea of the exhibition itself, so it was very easy. But generally, I tend to just keep this, again, like a free-flowing, situation. And I don't really sit around thinking that I'm going to curate a show at all. And in some ways, I was kind of thrown into it, So, but it was a good experience. As I said, I had a very different show in mind when I started off thinking I was going to curate a show. That's still, so that show is still in the back of my mind, and maybe I'll realize it at some point. And that's an exhibition, I think, which is, maybe it would be important for, more about the situation in Thailand and the politics and the divisions that's going on. Yes?
Thanks. You talked about the physically and life piece as kind of a metaphor, an inspiration and a metaphor for what you're hoping will happen to visitors in the galleries as they see one piece and then another. Can you give an example, perhaps, of some of the visuals that you've shown us of how you see one of these artworks triggering and maybe falling into and triggering another?
Yeah. If you saw the show, Maria Theresa's work is like kind of like the first thing you see, and it's a kind of flow. It's like a flow chart. So you start to float through the space with all of her maps, and you start to go in, and then you come into this room where Camille is, and then you start to look at the video of Camille, and in the video there's a native woman who's slowly unpacking a box of boats, in the video, and she's like a handmade boat. And as you go around the corner, you run into Michael's lexicon with the kind of little skeletons of ships. So there are just things that happens that and I must say I know of Camille's work, but I never saw that video, until that moment. But if you spend the time and get to that point, then there are some things that trigger. So I would say, as a curator, I'm as surprised as the audience is to look at the show. So.
So thinking about how so much of the work that you showed was like dealing with these fluid situations, which the gentleman was talking about, like the sort of global nature of it, and then kind of freeze framing it or stopping it, and so much of it being kind of dealing with political issues. What does it offer in terms of, like, what do some of these works do you offer in terms of the politics? Do they offer a critique that simply like exists in contemplation, or does it sort of push beyond that, or is that even not a horizon that's possible anymore?
I don't know if they kind of directly critique. I think there's a lot of mean, there's a lot of sense of possibility, you know, in terms of an irony, in terms of like how what happens to the work and what one looks at. And the works, some of the work are not new; they're actually also quite old. But then I find that they're still resonant in terms of like what goes on at the moment, you know. So I think that's something I find quite. I mean, again, like that I find in the works itself.
Does their resonance then speak to their inability to function politically? I mean, if they continue to be resonant and don't seem to change the landscape, then isn't that in some ways sort of like gesturing to their own futility?
I don't think it's trying to change things. I don't think it's trying to be political in those terms, you know. I think that, again, maybe it's about like being able to find a way out, you know. It's about like, perhaps for me it's more about the possibility of finding an alternate route, you know.
Can I answer it? Yeah, okay. So in working with Rirkirit on the project, like I'm going to add my 2 cents on this because I think it's something that I've been thinking about. And what I think that the show is not, it's not a critical show. It doesn't have a sort of the kind of criticality that I think you might be looking for. I think there's a lot of politics embedded in these works, but that the works are primarily presentational. In other words, they expose and they present situations. And those situations have a politics. And in some cases, like with the non-prick, it's bringing to you a very intense politics, but through a sort of softer means. You know, it's not around the rhetoric, or it's not even about. It doesn't even present itself as the crisis, but it still represents the crisis once you understand sort of the backstory, or you experience it and start to understand that your experience of it is leading you to a politics. So it's kind of more roundabout in that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the film of Luc Moulet is a good example of that. Actually.
The Genesis one?
Yeah.
I have a quick question about narrative. And there's a lot of talk about the stories embedded in the objects. And I'm curious what forms the narratives take. We've mentioned video, and are you leaving it up to viewers, because I haven't seen the show yet,
Yeah.
to come up with the story by spending that time with it?
Yeah.
Or are there certain narratives that pop out, or you know, they show up in videos or in print or in just with engagement?
I think there are moments of like very clear structures and stories, and then there are moments where you definitely, you know, have to construct it yourself. So, and I think that's kind of the modulation that's quite interesting in terms of the exhibition itself. And also, if you go through it, like just the way things are next to each other, how one flows into the other, or how one could read the idea of the sugar in one work and then the idea of the sweet in the other work, and how those things relate to each other. So it's a very kind of cross-pollinated situation. And but it is a show that I think you need to take time to, read and listen. So it would be good to go back a few times. But that's always been kind of a condition where, you know, of course, like people make films and certain kinds of time-based structure, and you do have to spend your time with it, and that's always been a very difficult thing, where, you know, one has to decide how much one wants to take their time. I kind of, there was one documentary at one point where there was like, you know, probably every other work was a video. And I went to it and I said to myself, if I enter into the room and I watch this thing, I'm going to stay through the whole thing. And if I'm not going to stay through the whole thing, I will not go in. You know, and this is a kind of commitment that one has to start to decide to make, you know.
And this idea of taking time to listen to the story, I'm wondering if the story of the longshoreman strike and why the shippers sitting on the docks is going to become part of that piece.
Yeah.
Well, I was hoping, I don't know, there was supposed to be a sign or signage or a kind of letter or from that situation that would be posted with the work. But of course I think the artists are in themselves quite aware of this kind of condition once you start to ship things and move it around. So yeah, I mean it'll be an extended part of the work itself.
You mentioned that you were doing some work at the Headlands. Could you allude to some of the projects that you're involved with there, please?
Well, I have just made dinner last night for fundraising, and I'm not doing very much. Like I was saying, I don't do very much. I just kind of enjoy the landscape, and actually I'm kind of spending more time, figuring out what I'm going to say at this kind of talk and studio visits. So that's what's occupying my time. I've never talked so much, I must say. And Betty Sue said, well, you could talk 3 more nights, and that would be. But it's been amazing weather, and everyone in San Francisco and the whole California seems to be going there. So there's a lot of traffic jam.
You mentioned having a vision when you were putting the show together. How do you personally feel about the outcome of the show?
I'm surprised. I'm surprised, in a kind of pleasure way, Like I was saying, a lot of the works I've known about, but I've never really experienced it myself. So even the work I knew really well, it was more a story that I'd heard or the artist had talked to me about. So in a way, it was the kind of, seeing something that was inside your head, become a reality. Yes?
What sorts of things do you cook?
What?
And are they saying anything? Are you making choices that would be interesting in this context?
Yeah. Usually, yes, I do, pick particular things to cook, and the food I made last night was based on, what was local. So I went to the farmer's market and spent a bit of time looking around. And, I found that there was a lot of mushrooms and a lot of roots. So I decided to make different, the food, of course, coming from my own personal background, is always very spicy and tends to be curry. And so I basically worked with that, but using kind of local ingredients. And I must say I haven't seen anyone who went to the dinner yet, so I don't know how. I don't know how it went. And and when I cook, I don't eat, so I tasted things, but I didn't eat, so I have no idea what happened. It was good? Oh, you were there?
Hi. I have a question about the politics behind calling this project a curatorial project. Because in a way, I've seen artists curate projects before, but then their role as the curator is usually underneath the listing of the artists within the exhibition. And I was really interested in the fact that that this exhibition is being framed as an artwork in itself, because the very first panel that introduces it is essentially your name at the top. Yes. And then within that you find out the artists who are a part of it. So I was really curious about that positioning and how you're kind of either claiming it as a curatorial project / artwork / just functioning as a curator, or what the kind of permeability of that is for you.
Yeah, I kept saying to them that my name is too big. I didn't want to be on that point, but I think I guess it's maybe very socialized. But of course, I can understand the desire of the institution to put me there. You want to say something?
So, yeah, I think that the way Rirkirit works is that he puts ideas out there and then he sort of allows other people into the process, and then is very kind of gracious and generous about how others participate in his process. I don't know. And I think that that's been alluded to before. So when we asked Rirkirit to curate this exhibition, I think that to deconstruct the title, yes, we wanted Rirkirit to be the main sort of protagonist of the story, and to see who he would choose to kind of accompany him on this journey of the exhibition. And by bringing artists into the exhibition that, like Ariane or Pachaya and other artists that are unfamiliar to us, that we would sort of be able to kind of access those artists through someone whose work we do know. And also that the title is a curatorial project with Rirkirit rather than by Rirkirit means that it's a kind of a sharing. It's kind of a sharing with, YBCA and the production team that did most of the work, with myself and with all of the artists and with the local artists that are here, 2 of whom are in this room. So Terry Friedman and Victoria Wagner, who are here and participated in the Museum of Gord. So that project kind of extends outward, but and at the same time it's kind of responding to Rirkirit's practice in general, but it also allows for other kinds of participation. So the construction of the title is sort of very purposeful, and then the way things go was Rirkirit's kind of, insertion of really wanting to make very, very present the Fischli Weiss video, and that is actually the underlying principle that actually guides a lot of this kind of cultural geography that is laid on top of it. So, anyway, that's my read of it.
I just want to ask, how long have you not had a studio by choice? And is your work conceived out of, with a studio, typically there's this idea that the artist works out of isolation and then kind of ventures out. And I just wanted to hear more of your thoughts on the importance of intimacy and relationships in creating these works that demand interaction with people and demand not being safe in one place.
Well, I still don't have a studio, and I have an office, and I won't let them call it studio, but it's a place where the computer sits, and actually I never go there. So I work with different people sometimes to make certain things, and but a lot of things I use are are already made, so you can buy pots anywhere. In terms of the intimacy, well, at one point I made an apartment in Cologne, and which was based on kind of having spent some time there on a kind of residency, and I was telling the story before that when I arrived, the curator gave me some money to buy things to, because I was the first one in the resident, and he wanted me to buy the bed and the chair and So in the process of buying all these things, I thought, well, I should then find a way to use them as a, in the exhibition that I would have to do after the residency. So then I built an apartment and put all those things in it. And then I left it and people came and stayed in it. And I think at the beginning everyone had this kind of, uncertain sense that things could go very wrong, right? And, nothing happened really. Everything that could happen that went on in there all was in good spirits. So, and I must say it's very, very, like the only way for me to make something that would be in a way open to that kind of closeness is to just like let it go, right? To just put it there and let it be taken over, and in some ways, by being able to like let it really go, somehow that gives the opportunity for everyone else to feel themselves with it. So I don't know if that answers that question.
Could you talk about the land project, the idea behind it?
Yeah.
What's happened and what you envision for the future?
Yeah. Well, the land project was initiated by myself and Camille Henry, a Thai artist, local Thai artist in Chiang Mai, and we both had this idea of kind of making a retirement home for artists at first, and we thought it would be a place to go away. I had a lot of friends that I knew we were traveling with and having exhibitions, and we had a discussion about like making a kind of safe house, a place to get away from all the shows and where we can go and sit and talk without having to think about the exhibition itself. So there was a kind of parallel desire at the same time. So then when I was in Chiang Mai, Camille said, let's go and have a look. There's some rice farmers are wanting to leave this area because there was too much water for the rice. And so we went and, was very reasonable. And of course it's like Thailand, it's like a place that, the rules aren't always respected. And there's bad things about that, but there are also good things about it. So we are able to kind of, proceed without having to have a lot of bureaucracy. And it became a kind of, we were thinking that it would be more like a kind of a living space. And it became more of an alternative space, and we started to kind of open it up and use it more for to, in a way, support younger artists. Because of course the institutions, the educational institutions are very hierarchical, and within Thai culture itself it's very difficult for young people to kind of actually have a voice or to actually say what they think. So the land was kind of used as a place where people could really go and say what they felt, and from that point on, it's kind of continued with inputs from people from many places, friends from all parts of the world, and so it's kind of like a lab, an ongoing lab. At this point, we've had a kind of residency that we do every other year, so we're in the process of trying to build a building that would support the residency.
On that note, I think it's about time for us to thank you and say goodnight.